And here we are. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ian Martin Allison. You might already know that if you're checking out this podcast, the SBL podcast. Typically, it's me and Scott. Do you say me and Scott? Scott and I, Scott and me. I've never, I grew up with a mother. She's very lovely, Beth, who would always correct me with grammar stuff. And there's a few things that I still say that I don't know if they're correct or not. And my mom is in my mind correcting me. But the sad thing is, I don't even know which way is right. And if I did, I probably wouldn't be obsessing about it, right? Because I would just say it correctly. So anyway, all that to say, hello. Thank you so much for being with me today. Solo show, B Squad, coming at you again because Scott is on holiday with his family. So he hit me up and he said, would you please do another solo podcast? I actually have a blast. I have a blast doing these. I love it, of course, when Scott's around. We're thinking too about bringing on some guests. Would you like that? I wonder if I should do a little poll and see who we should reach out to. I think it'd be really fun to start pulling in some people as Scott and I sort of start to think have we said all the things that there are to say that we have in our minds about the bass? But as I was thinking about this episode today. So I did a Q&A episode on my own. I also did one about sort of what I decided to do when COVID happened. So if you haven't checked out those episodes and you want to know more about me, if you're like, oh, I can't get enough of this guy, check those out. And I was actually going through some other previous episodes. It was so fun to go back and listen to a few things that Scott and I did right at the beginning. We did some really fun ones about gas, I hate that acronym, gear acquisition syndrome. I hate it when people are like, oh, I've got a bad case of gas. It's just like the worst dad joke to me. That said, I am not going to pretend that it doesn't exist. It does. People say it, gear acquisition syndrome. I think about gear as, for me, it's an addiction. It's something that I manage. And I was thinking today, we've done some stuff about gear. We talked about, Scott and I did an episode on gear, and then we did one on ordering a custom bass. But I wanted to dive a little deeper into this idea of, does it even matter? Does gear actually matter? Does it make a difference? Do people notice? Will it get you a better gig? Will you be happy? Right? These are sort of leading rhetorical questions here, but you see what I'm getting at, right? We all have, if we're honest with ourselves, a relationship with gear. Some of those relationships are probably very healthy. Like you think about that like a tool. Like, oh, I'm going to buy a bass and then, I don't know, whatever. That's just a bass that I have and play. If that's you, oh, I just wish that I could be more like that in ways. Because if you follow me on Instagram or you've seen the stuff that I do with SBL, you see I've got a bunch of instruments. You can't see them here. Maybe you can see a couple of them in the wings, but oh my gosh, lining the walls. I am a hopeless gear addict. But those are sort of negative words to use. I'm also an enthusiast. I guess, I don't know if I want to even say collector, because I have sort of bad associations or connotations with that word. Doesn't collector sound like somebody, like a doctor that, used to maybe play in a high school band, but really doesn't have anything to do with music actively anymore, but just likes instruments as art, hangs them on the wall? I definitely am not that kind of collector because this is what I do for a living. So they are tools, but I have a great friend named Dan Folds, plays in a band called Low Ray, and he has this great thing that I think about all the time. He's like, look, if you like guitars, basses, gear, buy that stuff. Like if you love it and you love the aesthetic and the design and you're going to use it also, he's like, dude, double art. He's like, what is another commodity that you can buy that is itself art, but that you can also use to make art? And he's like, double art. I love it. So if you love bass guitars and you think they're beautiful and you're into the design and you're a nerd about it like I am, and you're also going to use it on that session or with the band or when you're teaching lessons or whatever, do it. Oh, double art? Come on. That's the way, at least, that I have justified and stoked my addiction. So see, now I'm back to the negative words again, right? So I have this real love-hate relationship because I am drawn to this idea that the tone is all in your hands. And while I think that that is mostly true, I do think it sort of discounts the reason that I like gear. And I'm going to get into all of this. I'm going to tell you, though, spoiler, the reason that I think gear actually does matter is because of inspiration. I find that when I am inspired by a new sound, a new feeling, a new riff, that's what even pushes me into the next level of growth. Sometimes even as much as practicing scales. Not to say this is a slippery slope. Oh God, Allison. I just feel like I'm saying like, oh, as much as practicing, buying a piece of gear can better your playing. Not better your playing. Buying a piece of gear will not make you more skilled, but what it might do is give you a different perspective. You've never played a bass with flat wounds and you buy that. Wow. And now maybe you kind of dig that sound and you want to check out Jamerson. It leads you down a path maybe of inspiration, which may lead you to some motivation to get your skills together. Or another road, like with effects. You find a sound that you think is so compelling and maybe you write a bit of music that never would have happened maybe without hearing that sound. And that's huge. That's huge. Creative inspiration. Wow, that's huge. And if a little $200 pedal can inspire you to write a song or a part or get something together and start to think about what you might use on a session or with your band, that seems like a really worthwhile investment to me. But again, here we go. It's the slippery slope, right? Because then it starts to get easy to just start to buy stuff. And instead of being creative, you're on Reverb or Talkbass or eBay, and you're looking at classified sections and you're checking out Facebook Marketplace. I'm just talking to myself right now. Instead of looking for that next high, right? Instead of using the things that you already have for inspiration. So it's self-awareness, of course. But let's talk about this idea that the tone is in your hands. I really do think that's true, actually. I really do think that the tone that you get out of your instrument really does start with your hands, your technique, your fundamental skills on the instrument, right? And some of the greatest players that I have ever seen sound the same no matter what gear they're using. A great example of that is Geddy Lee from the band Rush. Now, if you don't know Geddy Lee, he has a really intense right-hand attack, and he's used, he came up using Rickenbackers and then a Fender jazz bass. Then he had some time in the 80s where he was playing Steinbergers and Walls. So those two instruments, a Steinberger and a Wall, are bright and modern and different sounding, ostensibly, to a Rickenbacker and a jazz bass. Yet coming up listening to that band, could never tell what bass he was playing. Ever. Like if someone had a gun to my head and said, what is this? I would have, out of those four instruments, I would have a 25% chance of survival because I was like, I have no idea. And then, of course, I learned over time and I read, on this record he used this and on this, that, right? But when I just heard him play in that blissful state of ignorance in terms of, on this record, he was, of course, playing the Rickenbacker. When I didn't know any of that, it just sounded like Geddy. And boy, that is compelling. That is so compelling to have such a strong sound that no matter what tool you're using, it kind of sounds like you. Shout out to my good friend Justin Charbonneau, a great guitar player who he will do this thing where he will revamp his entire rig every year or so, maybe even more often sometimes, but he'll do this thing where he'll throw everything out, right? He'll sell a bunch of stuff and he'll buy new amps and he'll have different cables and then he'll get a new guitar and it has different pickups and probably different strings and he's got different pedals and right, he revamps everything. And then when he plays, it sounds the same. Do you have any friends like that? Or maybe are you like that? I think that I have that in a way too, where, if I'm just playing a bass, there's a sound that I want to hear. So I'm just adjusting my hand position. I'm adjusting the knobs on whatever instrument I'm using so that I kind of hear that same sound. And I remember I have this, 80s bass called a Kubicki Factor, which was a bass that I came up loving as a kid. And I finally got one and I brought it to a gig and it looks kind of crazy. And my drummer friend Grady said to me, "That is probably the most different bass I've ever seen you play. That said, I close my eyes and it's identical to any other bass you play." And in a way, I mean, I want to take that as a compliment, right? I think it is a compliment, but it's also kind of a bummer because we think, right, that we're going to get this new sound when we buy that new thing. But if you already kind of have the sound, maybe you are the sound. Maybe you are the sound. Doug Wimbish has this great thing. Oh man, I've heard him say it on a few different podcasts. Doug Wimbish, incredible session bass player, plays now with a band called Living Color. And he played in Sugar Hill Gang. He's played with Seal, Annie Lennox. I'm forgetting. I don't have the list in front of me, but an incredible player, incredible session player, creative, is known for having the big aircraft carrier pedal board, right? And someone asked him, I think I asked him once, and I heard this on another podcast where someone said, what are your favorite effects, or what effects do you like to bring? What are your go-to effects that you bring in the studio? And he always holds up 10 fingers. And he goes, "These right here, these are my favorite 10 effects." And then he said to me, "I am the effect." That is powerful. And I was like, whoa. He said it, through a screen. I was like, "Oh, talk to me about effects, man." He's like, "Well, first of all, Ian, I am the effect." He just looked at me and I was like, "Damn, Doug." That is hard. It's so good. It's such a great way to think about it too, because you are bringing yourself to all these boxes. You plug me into Doug Wimbish's pedal board, and I'm not going to sound like Doug Wimbish. You know what I'm saying? So it is very, very much about what you bring. And, another friend of mine used to call it bone tone, which always made me feel uncomfortable. And in fact, now I'm regretting even saying it. You don't need to say that. But it's this idea, right, that your hands, that the bones, your muscles, your sinew, your brain, your blood, your heart, that is your sound. And now I'm having a bit of anxiety about if I used the correct last name for the Doug that I was referencing. I hope when I referenced him in the beginning, I was saying Doug Wimbish. I maybe said Doug Pinnock, but I don't think I did. I was talking, though, specifically about Doug Wimbish, but another Doug that I love is Doug Pinnock from King's X, who played these big octave string basses in the beginning with that band. Left-handed bass player, also the lead singer, playing 12-string basses with this grind and had this sound. And dude, he is another guy. When he would play a different bass that wasn't even a 12-string, it always just sounded the same. In fact, it's really hard to discern what tracks he used a 12-string on and what he used a straight 4-string on, because he had a particular way that he liked to set the distortion on his rig, right? And it just became his sound. It didn't even matter if he was playing a 12-string or a 4-string, and that is crazy. If you don't know, there might be a video coming out soon on SBL about octave string basses. A 12-string bass, yeah, you want to know? Check this out. A 12-string bass. The headstock looks like this. If you're not watching this on SBL, tune in. It basically is a 4-string bass. There are the tuning pegs for the regular EADG, and then every string set is grouped into groupings of 3, and the other 2 strings are tuned up an octave. So you have this chime. It's not plugged in, and it's out of tune. The D string sounds nice though, right? Just a crazy sound. And you crank that up through some distortion. Holy moly. It sounds like a giant piano or bass and guitar together, and it's just massive. And Doug Pinnock from King's X has such a signature sound that it doesn't matter if he's using this or a 4-string bass. It always kind of sounds the same. And I think that's sort of badass, right? Let me put this away. Okay. So check this out. In my complicated relationship with gear early on, I was really of this mindset. When I started to play the bass, and I wonder if this is the same for you, or see how this kind of like lines up with your own story. When I started to play, I wanted to be different. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to have my own thing. But that was, of course, an amalgamation of all the things I was listening to, like Rush and Yes and Dream Theater. But I did not want to play a vintage bass. Oh, gross. Gag me. Yuck. Get it out of my face. I don't want your Fender. That's how I felt in the beginning, like, ugh. And even like the color Sunburst, I remember thinking like, dumb, yuck, so stupid. It's like a dad color, because I just associated it with like old, stodgy 60s and 70s music, because I was into prog rock, baby. I wanted that quilted maple top. I wanted that purple finish. I wanted that gold hardware, maybe some Spurzel locking tuners. Carvin catalog, anybody with me? Right? I wanted to be different. Now, that said, I was just doing the same thing that probably everyone was sort of doing that was my age. But I had this real desire to not play an old bass. And I remember I have a cousin named Allison Towner, killing bass player and producer in Hollywood. Dude is just the best. And I remember he had an old jazz bass, and he was like, man, I don't know. I think that someday you're just going to come back to Fender. He told me that when I was like 15, and I was like, no way. Like, it'll never happen. And then I'm in this rock band. Then I have this studio experience where I was in New York, actually in Hoboken, New Jersey, with Mr. David Bendith. David, if you ever listen to this, you were a tough ass producer. And you were right. David Bendith challenged a lot of notions that I had, of like truths that I had. My band, I was in a band called Down and Above, and we went out to record with David Bendith. And he said to me before we left for the trip, he said, make sure to just bring like a passive Fender. And I said, what? He said, just bring like a P bass or a jazz bass if you can. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I was like, don't worry, I've got something better. And he said, uh-oh. I'll never forget, on the phone, he said, he has a really low voice, and he goes, uh-oh. And I was like, no, man, it's going to be cool. And he was like, all right. And I had at that time a 4-string modulus that had, Bartolini's, and it was active, and an awesome bass, but it wasn't what he was asking for. And I remember brought that bass and we played, and he let me play it on the stuff, and it was fine and it sounded good. But then at the end of the session, because we had talked a lot, and he said, hey man, what do you want to do? Do you want to be in this band forever? And I said, well, I mean, yeah, but, and he said, do you ever want to play with other people? Because he said some nice things about my playing. He's like, do you want to play with other artists and on other records and things? I said, yeah, actually I do. Because during this time I was also getting into, wow, Tony Levin. Wow, he's a side musician, but he has such a cool, interesting voice. Oh, Pino Palladino. Wow, he's got such an interesting voice too. He's doing all this fretless work with Don Henley, Paul Young. And so I was sort of like interested in these other players that were sort of session players, but that had a voice. That was so intriguing to me. Like how Tony Levin could play with the Liquid Tension experiment and also Peter Gabriel, and kind of bring those two wildly different things, wildly different projects, something really unique and cool with his voice on the instrument. So I was really intrigued by that. So I said, yeah, I would love to do that. He said, okay, well then you need to expand your horizons a little bit and check out some vintage instruments. You at least just need to know what they are and what they do and what they sound like. And he said, let's do a thing. He said, do you see that jazz bass on the wall? And there was, I'll never forget, a sage green Mexican-made Fender jazz bass hanging on the wall. I was like, yeah. He's like, well, why don't you go grab that? Okay. And I did, and I grabbed it, plugged it in. He got the gain stage set. He was like, okay, let's just play along to the track that we just did, and I played that jazz bass, and my heart sunk because it sounded so good. I could kind of hear all the notes. There was like a woody, organic bark to it. There was this quality that I just was like, oh, this is cool. It was somehow simultaneously sitting in the mix and poking out of the mix. Whereas with my modulus, and no shade to modulus or Bartolini or graphite necks or anything, but we were just sort of struggling in that context to fit that instrument into the mix with EQ and compression. And this Fender just seemed to sort of like sit and stick out. And we got done and he just sort of turned around and looked at me. And I was like, I think I get it. He's like, yeah, it's just not to say that the bass you brought is wrong. It's just that this might be better. And you need to be open to that. And I was like, whoa. And then he said some things too, where he said, so if you are open to that, take the next step. And instead of just being open to it and just having a P bass around to, in case you have to use it, oh God, dear God, I have to use the P bass. Don't think about it that way. You have to think about it like you have to fall in love with those classic sounds. They're thumbprints. They're classic for a reason. Figure out why and fall in love with that. It will just give you more perspective on the things that you actually like. So he said, how familiar are you with Paul McCartney's work? And I said, not very. I'm in my early 20s at that point. He's like, well, get familiar with it. Don't just tolerate how a Hofner sounds. Fall in love with the way a Hofner sounds. And I thought, this is painful, but it is very smart. And we all have that happen to us in the studio, probably at some level, where you go in to record with your band, you're going to do a thing, and you just spent a lot of money on this fancy bass that is made of, the finest wood and has the most expensive, electronics and has 2 batteries, 18 volts, more headroom. Yes. Right. And you get in the studio and the producer's like, you mind playing the Squier P bass? And you're like, what? And then you do. And it is humbling because the $285 instrument just smoked your $7,000 boutique bass. That is a humbling feeling. And instead of getting the chip on your shoulder, you need to investigate why. Why is that the case? Why is the split coil precision bass pickup so amazing in the studio? Part of it, I would argue, is nostalgia. It's what we're used to hearing. It's what engineers are used to hearing on records. It's what they have their preset templates set up for. It's not to say that the bass that you have is quote unquote wrong. It's just to say that having a healthy respect for those classic instruments is so good for you, especially if you endeavor to make music that isn't always just your own project, right? So, of course, this started me down this insane road of ooh, it would be really cool to get a good Hofner. Ooh, it would be really good to get a Mustang. Oh, wow, maybe a Thunderbird, right? So I went bonkers. And every year since, I have had a goal of okay, this year I'm going to try to find a really great bass 6. This year I really need to get a solid P bass that I can always leave flats on. Okay, this year, right? And it goes back to my childhood, you guys. I mean, my father was going back in the back rooms of toy stores looking for particular Star Wars action figures for me when I was too young to even play with them. Old Bob Allison is a collector at heart. He has some very, very cool collections in his life. And he certainly passed that on to me. I grew up thinking that collecting was cool. And it is in a sense, but it also can be, sometimes it can get in the way of doing the work, being creative. Whereas an instrument or a sound can inspire creativity, just constantly looking on reverb can take away your hours to be creative or to work on your craft, right? So it is about that balance. But I will say, what I love about a different instrument is that I want to then bend to it. So I have some basses that feel very me. I'm going to pull one up right now. The bass that I got used to playing is this. Now, if you're watching it, you can see it. If you're not, I'll describe it to you. This is a 1978 jazz bass in Antigua, which is a polarizing color, but I love it so much. And if you don't like it, shame on you. I love, love, love this instrument. And why? Well, I fell in love with the color first. I found it on eBay, and I think I told the story of how I acquired it, and it's a funny story, but if you want to check that out, it's on the Gas episode of the podcast. But when I got it, I hadn't compared it. I was coming to the jazz bass, the passive Fender jazz bass, pretty new, and I hadn't really compared it to anything. So I just started to play it. I didn't know that it was too heavy. I didn't know that an 11-pound jazz bass was not normal. I didn't know that it wasn't supposed to have gaping, insane neck pocket gaps. To be honest, I didn't really notice. It was kind of quieter. The pickups were a little quieter, but I ended up just sort of turning up my preamp gain or, adjusting my amplifier or preamp for it. And then it was fine. It had all this character. But then I started to read forums. I started to look around and check out on TalkBass, and there are a lot of people saying that 1978 was the worst year ever for Fender. And I sort of think, oh, am I just wrong? Do I not know what I'm talking about? And then that started this search for the holy grail. I have, in the last 20 years, 15 years, bought and sold more jazz basses than I care to admit. Way more than 10, probably more than 20. Trying to find the one, the holy grail. And guess what? It doesn't exist. Do you know what the best jazz bass in the world is? It's my 1978 Antigua. I spent so long trying to beat it and trying to get something better. And I would get these instruments and I would have a custom shop bass that I paid a lot of money for, and it was beautiful. No neck pocket gaps. Beautiful hand wound pickups. Yes. The body sorted for weight. Yes. Quarter sawn maple neck. Yes. Rosewood slab fingerboard. Ooh, slab is such a buzzword. Oh, the perfect vintage radius. Yes. Yes. Stacked knobs. Oh, detents around the tone control. And if you compared that, if I played that, it was louder. It had more bass content. The sustain was better. The notes were more even. And I'd bring it to the gig and I'd be like, yes, now I've found it. This is the holy grail. And whenever I would play it, I would miss my Antigua jazz bass. And I would go, why do I want to play the one that isn't as good? On paper, these instruments are so different. And this one that I'm playing now, this custom shop or whatever, is so much quote unquote better. Why am I missing my crappy late 70s jazz bass? I will tell you why. It is because it's the one that imprinted on me, or I imprinted on it. I don't know how that works, but it's the one that I spent the most time with. Do you know who understands this really well? Classical musicians. You don't meet too many upright bass players that have 30 upright basses. You don't meet too many cellists that have 27 cellos. You don't meet too many violinists that have 58 violins, right? They kind of have one or two or three. Maybe there's a travel one, but there is an instrument in classical musician world that you buy and you worry about you. You don't worry about the instrument. There's my friend, the great Aaron Fabrini, a great bass player, said the best bass is the one that is in your hands. The best bass is the one that you are playing right now. That's the one. And classical musicians understand this partly because of size, right? I mean, especially upright bass players. I mean, you can't, who's going to have 50 of those, right? In this warehouse. Can you imagine? I mean, I'm sure that person exists, but it's certainly not normal. not for a gigging musician anyway, not for a working musician. And so there's this idea that you buy the instrument and then you adapt to the instrument. And I think that is so compelling. So I am pulled in these different directions with basses, you guys. Oh, like I hear people like Marcus Miller saying, commit to an instrument because it's going to be part of your sound. It's going to be part of your branding. It's going to be part of your aesthetic. I see my friend Corey Wong, who before he was Corey Wong, the international superstar, he was playing a Tele, he was playing a big jazz box hollow body. But when you hear the name Corey Wong, what guitar immediately springs to mind? Of course it's a Stratocaster. Of course it is. Right? That's how he has branded himself. And it's so smart and it's so cool. And it's not to say that he doesn't play other things occasionally, but what if Corey just showed up and he was always playing a Tele? It would feel strange. It might not sound much different, but aesthetically, branding wise, right? It would feel odd because he has really intentionally made a name for himself and his sound with the Stratocaster as his, that's the sidekick, right? That's the tool of choice. And it's part of his brand. Scott Devine is another great example. In that same podcast, I referenced the Gas podcast. Scott talks about all of these players, I think Tony Gray, Yannick Wisdala, Matt Garrison, all playing Foderas with high Cs, all single cut Foderas with high Cs. So a 5-string that's tuned E-A-D-G-C, playing fast Hadrian Farode, right? Even Sean Hurley was doing that in the beginning. And then Scott decided what could be, he's like, I'm not like these players. And he's like, I'm not really endeavoring to be like these players. What is something that could set me apart? What if I played this kind of music on a P bass? And he, same for me, grew up not loving Fenders, did not want to play a Fender P bass, but he chose that because he thought it was going to set him apart in the marketplace. And that is a pretty bold move. And then he learned to love it. He actually fell in love with the sound, but it didn't start as him going, oh, I just love the sound of the P bass. He wanted to set himself apart. And what could be what's the antithesis of all of that, Fodera high C shredder bass player thing? A P bass with flats. Hell yeah, it is. And I remember being so inspired by that, actually. I thought it was so cool. And there was a time for me where I was really trying to be P-bass guy. And I was, oh yeah, only play. I even said in some stuff like, P-bass is the thing that I do for 90% of the things that I do, which wasn't even true. I was just trying to be cool. I was trying to be one of the cool guys. I was trying to be like Sean, trying to be like Scott, trying to be like Tim LaFave. Hey, right? And then the more I did it, the more I thought, oh, the P-bass is not really me. It's a tool that I can use. I'm always going to play that instrument if a song requires it, or if a band, if like there's a tour or an artist that's like, that's the vibe, I'm happy to play it. But it never feels like me completely. What feels like me, I have 2 jazz basses that I absolutely adore. That 78 that I always have rounds on, and then I have a really beat up 68 that I always have flats on, and I fell in love with it when I played a G note on that bass, and I died. It was honest and beautiful and warm and understated and cool. Oh, and I just fell in love. But that thing too, I think the tuners are replaced and had different pots, and it also was like the finish was falling off of it, and there was just things about it that were weird, and the pickups are really microphonic, but it is my jazz bass. I have these 2 that I love, and I can't seem to beat them. So then why do I continue to buy and to be excited about all of these other instruments? Part of it, I think, is that I really do value people that think about aesthetic, design, and craftsmanship. So, for instance, another instrument that I'm going to pull up for you is I have a signature bass with Voron Saku in Finland, Saku Vuore, makes these unbelievable instruments, and he wanted to make me a short scale bass. And I thought, that is a really cool idea to do a short scale. So it's not going to be, I'm not going to have the same expectations as I'm going to have on a jazz bass. What would be my ultimate short scale bass? And he made, this is the Ian Martin Allison signature. I'm going to grab it. Check it out. This bass right here. And it is all of the things that I love about Fenders. So it's so cool. The headstock is kind of like, it's a reversed headstock, like a 51 style P bass, which I love 51 P basses. Oh, those are my favorite P basses out of all the P basses. It has a real thick front to back chunky neck, like the late 70s jazz basses and maybe even the mid 70s P basses, that B neck that's so great. It has a bridge where the strings go into the body, and then you have this happening kind of like on a bass 6 or a jazz master, like an offset Fender guitar tradition. It has 2 single coil pickups like a jazz bass, but it has pickup switches like a bass 6 or like a Jaguar. It's short scale, and it has a body style that is maybe a little more similar to like a Mustang or Music Master. So it's kind of like we took all of the things that I absolutely love and admire about Fender basses, like the Fender Bass Company, and put them all into one unbelievable signature instrument. And of all the short scales I've ever played in my life, it is my fave. And I wasn't totally expecting that it would be. I was like, oh yeah, like he wanted to make me this thing, and I thought, oh yeah, okay, cool. And then I got it, and I couldn't believe how perfect it was for the thing that I wanted out of a short scale bass. Now, is it the bass that I'm going to play forever on everything? No, because it's not right for absolutely everything, but it's right for a lot of things. And it is so cool. And here's the thing, without going down this crazy gear rabbit hole, I wouldn't know how to order something like this. And maybe that doesn't matter, but it was really interesting to be able to specify neck dimensions. I've played enough Fenders to know this is what I like, to really specify what I like about a radius on a fingerboard, to really talk about what I like about fret height or what I hate about fret height and fret width, how I want the pickups situated, right? What kind of switching options I want on an instrument like this. That was all out of my nerdy, insane gear thing that I have, right? I'm not saying that you need to have that too. I'm just saying that because I've played so many instruments, and I have this thing of like, I want to own or at least have played for a while one of all of the classic designs in my life before I die. Because I have that knowledge rolling around in the old cabeza, putting together an instrument or thinking conceptually about how to design an instrument is easy for me. It's easy because I have all of those references in my mind. I'm like, oh, that would kind of make it like a 51 bass. Oh, that would kind of lean it closer to a jazz bass. And so I have been so intrigued with gear, not just from a player perspective, but also from like a design perspective. I think the people that dedicate their lives to designing beautiful, amazing products, and making something that is gorgeous and that solves a problem and that is double art, right? That is an instrument that is beautiful and really thoughtfully designed, and also you're going to use to make beautiful, thoughtfully designed music. Those people are superheroes to me. Like Saku Viore is a frickin' superhero to me. I love him. I love that he has dedicated his life to this thing. Right? So that's part of the reason too, is I just connect with these people and these stories. And I think that is such a fun part of this whole process. It's not just about this hunk of wood and metal, right? It's about the person that made it. It's about Saku. This body is made out of pine. He went into, I think it was an old school or church in his hometown, and pulled up these floorboards that were just going to go into a dumpster. And he made this out of old pine blanks. So it's lightweight and really resonant and cool. And I mean, that is just incredible. And he said, what do you want it made out of? Alder, ash, I suppose. I said, no. What could you make it out of that would be cooler, more interesting, more finish? because I wanted him to put himself into it too, you know? And then I wanted to bend myself. I already have this jazz bass that is just so me. So then I want an opportunity to bend myself around another piece so that I'm not just always bringing the trappings and tropes of, oh, well, it's not like my jazz bass, so No, I want to really try. I want to grow. I want to like other things, right? So how we doing? Let me tell you a story about amps. You're like, okay, that's a lot about basses, Ian. That's a lot about basses. I know it is. Let me tell you the story about amps. So then I got super crazy into amps, and I get this question all the time of like, Ian, what amp should I get? I hate it when you ask me that question, by the way. Don't ask me that question. Or if you do, set it up. I want to know everything. If you're going to ask me that question in a DM, I want you to say, this is how long I've been playing. Here's the bass I have. Here's the types of rooms I'm playing in. I play this type of music with this type of band. It's a moderate volume, but I also do jazz brunch, so I need an amp that can, you know what I'm saying? Give me some context. Because I often get this question, this crazy open-ended question, what amp should I get? Like, I don't know. Here's my story with amps. When I started to play, my teacher told me that I was not allowed to play with an amp, and I literally had to put my head against the bass and play it and hear the vibration come out of the bass and get a clean sound. Actually, John Davis from the band Nerve was just talking about this on an SBL podcast episode. His episode is amazing. You should check out John Davis's episode, just a few episodes back. But he talked about how he thinks about the electric bass as an acoustic instrument. And I really could not agree more that you're trying to get a nice sound out of this thing even before you plug it in. So my first teacher, even though that was kind of a rough thing to do to a 13-year-old, it taught me this bass isn't plugged in. But it taught me that if I did this, ooh, that's not the sound I want. Now that sound might kind of get covered up by an amp with a ton of bottom end. But if I'm playing without an amp and I do this, I'm fretting more clean now. I'm getting a nice draw out of the bass. I'm getting a cleaner sound, right? That stuff is so important, first of all. So when I finally got an amp, I went amp crazy. I've had so many amps over the years, so many. And what I have learned is this: the musicians you're playing with, the room you're playing in, and the front of house PA support or lack thereof are all far more important than the brand of amp, than if it has a tube preamp, than if you're playing 12s or 10s. None of that stuff matters. You know why? You put your most expensive, fancy, holy grail, unbelievable amp in a crappy room with a crappy sound person, and it is going to sound like shit. That said, you've got a crappy amp that makes noise, but you plug that DI into the house and it's a beautiful room, a beautiful PA, a beautiful sound person. Your bass is going to sound fabulous. And it took me a really long time to figure that out. Check this out. I have a Sadowski SA200, which was a very boutique, small batch run artisan amp, and it's amazing. A tube amp, an all tube amp that Sadowski made, I believe, in the 90s. And I paid a lot of money for it, and then I'm finding the right cab for it, and I'm buying fancy speaker cables, and I'm buying fancy NOS tubes. Two experiences I had with that amp. First of all, I had it on a wedding gig outside where we're playing for a lovely bride and groom that were just married. And we're playing, this is years and years ago, we're playing something like Brown-Eyed Girl. And that amp flames a power tube and the whole bass just goes away. And suddenly we go from this nice moment of having no bass, and it's a scramble, and now I'm trying to plug in a DI, and it was brutal. And it ruined that song and that moment at that specific place because I was so damn precious about having the fanciest amp. Before I bought that amp, I remember asking my wife about it, and she was like, well, what is it? I'm like, it's like supposed to be the best amp. And she goes, why do you even need the best amp? And I was like, because it's the best amp. She's like, yeah, but why do you need that? Like, you're a good player. Don't you, like, couldn't you sound great on any amp? And I'm like, but it's the best though, you know? She's like, okay. And she was right. But I had to figure that out for myself. Second story with that amp. Okay, now I've bought a Bergantino cabinet and I have fancy pedals and a bass and I have spent a lot of money on chords and oh yes. And I'm playing Ice House in Minneapolis with a rock band I used to play with called Verscozzi. He's now in LA, incredible producer. And Jim Anton, who is a fabulous Minneapolis bass player, played with Prince, played with Johnny Lang, played with a bunch of amazing artists, was at the gig, and we were opening up for his band. They were called the Droppers. And he walked up to the front of the stage, Jim Anton, who I respect greatly. And he looked at my rig and he was like, man, fancy setup. And I said, oh, yeah, cool, man, thanks, yeah. He's like, wow, it looks great. And I said, oh, thanks a lot, yeah. And I'm like, do you want to play it? You would be welcome to play it. He's like, no, it's all right. I was like, you sure? I didn't see you bring anything in. And he's like, yeah, I'm just gonna, he's like, I'm just gonna use the house amp. I said, there's a house amp? He's like, yeah. Well, oh, I didn't know that. What is it? Oh, it's right over here. And I looked and it was a Line 6 low down 10. You ever seen one of those? It kicks back like a wedge monitor and it's a 1 10-inch speaker, tiny little combo amp, right? And there are like a group of people that think they're really great. There's sort of like a cult around that product. But at the time I didn't know that, and I was like, oh, that really? I'm like, are you sure you don't want to use mine? He's like, oh yeah. He's like, it's fine. And I know it and it's all good. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. We played our set. I probably had $10,000 worth of bass gear on the stage. We played our set. I probably ran my rig a little too loud. I don't think I was in the PA at all. It was kind of a small room. Our set was fine. It was fine. It was average. B-. The Droppers got up, Jim Anton, and played a fucking A+ killer masterclass of a set. He took a solo. He was playing like a chopped up Mustang bass, like kind of like a pawn shoppy, not like the branded pawn shop, but like actually a Mustang bass that he got in a pawn shop that had an extra pickup routed in it. And like that stuff is anathema to me. Like I would never do that, right? But he doesn't, like it doesn't matter. Because of the bass he's playing. It's the best bass. You know why? Because Jim Anton's playing it. And he's playing through this, quote unquote, crappy little combo amp. But he's got a big sound and they're pushing in the PA and his concept is so lovely. And he's playing really soft until it's time for him to poke out. And then he plays hard and he's just huge, right? And he takes a solo and it's beautiful and people clap, brings down the house. And I think, what the hell am I doing? I have put so much time, energy, and money into this amp, into this rig. It doesn't matter. What if I'd taken 1/10 of that time, energy, and money and put it into developing my solo concept, trying to get a really nice sound out of the worst amp? Why not buy the worst amp? I wish someone would ask me, what's the worst amp? What's the worst amp? Because I want to see if I can get a good sound on it. I want someone to ask me that. Please ask me that. What's the worst amp that I could possibly plug into and I'm going to make it work? I love that spirit. That said, I don't live by that spirit. I don't live by that concept, but it's something that I'm so drawn to. And I have those lessons that come up for me over and over again in my life. And it's very compelling. That said, I like amps like I like basses, or I think they're beautiful. I think they're showpieces. I think a beautiful amp backline is gorgeous. I think it actually like brings up the aesthetic of the stage. I care more about that than I do the particular brand or speaker size. Like if I'm playing a gig that needs a big backline, I want 2 810s, or I want a 412, an Ampeg V4, which I have with a cool big head on it because it's going to look right on that stage. I don't want a little combo, a Hartke combo, even if it sounded better, because it wouldn't be the right vibe. So sometimes, and that might be shallow, right? That might be really shallow, but I think that stuff matters more than we let ourselves believe or more than we're willing to admit. So let me just admit it for you. Amps look cool. I care about that more than how they sound. Let's talk for a minute about effects. Hey, Listen, I get a lot of questions also about effects. What sound are you using on that? Where do you set your knobs on this? Should I get this compressor? What's your favorite octave? What's all that stuff, right? And I'm happy to answer those questions from my perspective, but that's just it. It's just my perspective. The thing that you have to understand about effects is that game is as deep as investing into any genre or any technique. Learning how to really build a beautiful sound with effects, it's not easy. And it's not something that just comes overnight, and it is not solved by buying a few pedals and having no idea what to do with them. You have to research. It's trial and error. It's practice is what it is. It's practice. Building a beautiful sound with some pedals, it's taken me a long time, and I'm not here saying, oh, I build beautiful sounds with pedals, but it is something that I really enjoy endeavoring to do. I'm going to put this bass down one sec. So here's what I want to say. If you're wondering about effects and you're saying, where do you have your knob set? It's just such the wrong question. Hey, Ian, what pedal do you use for this? Happy to tell you, but it's the wrong question. You know what the right question is? What inspired you to make you want to make that sound? Now, if you're listening to this at 1.2 or 1.5, I'm going to say that again a little slower. The right question is, what did you listen to that made you want to make that sound? What experiences have you had in your life that made you go after that sound or made you like that sound? What about where you grew up made you want to make that sound? That is what you need to get at. So for me, that has been a really interesting journey. I fell in love with octave pedal sounds really early on, hearing guys like Tony Levin play Sledgehammer. So I got so excited. I'm going to pull this bass up. I got so excited about getting an EBS octave pedal, which I don't have anymore, sadly. Turning on a bit of chorus, right? Taking my jazz bass and going for that sound. It's such a lovely sound, right? And then the more I got into hip hop music and electronic music, the more I was listening, the more I thought, wow, you can turn off your dry signal and then you can sound like a synthesizer. That's amazing. Then you can turn on a little bit of drive with that. Oh, what if you turn on a little bit of drive? Wow. Now it really sounds animal, alive, hairy. But it is not because it's not because I bought a bunch of pedals. It's because I was hearing things that I wanted to sound like. That's what I'm trying to say here. It's not because I was like, oh, well, on every bass pedal board, there should be an octave pedal and a tuner and a distortion pedal. And that's fine. But you won't probably find sounds that connect with your soul. Now, you might hear this sound and you might think that doesn't sound good to me. And that's okay. Guess what? A difference of opinion. I know it's kind of like not a cool thing to say right now, but you know what? We can have different opinions. It's totally fine. You don't have to like that sound, right? There are sounds that people have based their whole careers on that I don't particularly like for me. But that doesn't mean that it's not right for them, right? So the thing is, what about your music listening? What about your past? What about your current inspiration makes you want to make certain sounds? What about the movies that you've watched, the media that you've consumed, the experiences you've had, your relationship with your father, with your mother? What about that can inform your playing? That is such a question that we don't ask ourselves, and I think we need to more. Something for me that's more sort of recent that I have to tell you about is I grew up in Montana. And when I left Montana, I've never felt more Montanan. And even though I left because, the only stuff that's happening here is, classic rock and roll and country music, and I'm not a part of that. And I'm going to go to the city and I'm going to like really play like electronic music, and I'm really going to get into being an urban dweller. And then I just have had this longing, especially the last several years, of like, oh, what about that terrain is inspiring in Montana? What about country music do I love, right? And I discovered this sound. My father actually bought an old Fender, it wasn't old, he bought it brand new in 92, a Fender Vibro King amp that had spring reverb and tremolo. And I'll never forget plugging my bass into that, which was sort of a no-no. I remember thinking, oh, it'll explode. I even had someone from the store was like, you can't plug your bass into that, it'll explode. It's not true. Plug your bass into all the guitar amps. They won't explode. Just, be cautious with a caveat of don't do it with your active bass and turn the bass control all the way up, right? But there's this character, and the Vibro King has spring reverb in front of a tremolo. So I have a setup in the HX Stomp where, oops, that's not it, where when I play, you hear the tremolo is affecting the reverb tail. And this sound it's beautiful to me. I just want to make a record of just this music. And that was a result of me getting so interested in that sound. And I actually bought a Bass 6, which is if you don't know what a Bass 6 is, it looks like a giant, it's a Fender product that they made in the 60s. Now they make custom shop versions, and it has 6 strings, but it's not tuned like a 6-string bass. It's tuned like a guitar, E, A, D, G, B, E, but a full octave down. So you can play open chords on it. I mean, it's real murky, but it's that baritone guitar thing. And I thought, ooh, if I really want to get into that sound, I better have the right instrument. And I'm glad I have it, and I play it on sessions. But what I discovered is I wasn't actually after that instrument. The Bass 6 wasn't the thing I was after. I was after that feeling. I was after the sound. I was after the sound of spring reverb into tremolo, picked back by the bridge. It is inspiring to me. Glenn Campbell. Right? And I just want to play this sound all the time. It feels like me, while simultaneously, this also feels like me. This is my city. This is Minneapolis, right? Like this kind of vibe. This is like the city version of me. And then this is where I'm from. Right? And those two things are very different. And guess what? That's cool. It's cool that they're different. It's cool that you have a duality. You can be more than one thing, right? I don't know that I would have had that burst of inspiration for that sound. I don't know that I would have felt that longing feeling of chasing that sound if I hadn't first experienced a piece of gear that made the sound. I plugged into that Vibro King of my father's and went, whoa. And then ever since I've been just trying to get it out of the things that I have. And so while I have that amp sitting in the other room, I don't need to play that to get that feeling. I just needed the concept. I needed the knowledge of, oh, wow, you put a spring reverb in front of a tremolo and you pick your instrument in this certain kind of way. I'm just using a pick and I'm playing kind of back by the bridge. And I think and it feels like me, like it makes me feel emotional when I play with that sound. And that is something that is absolutely critical to pursue. And it doesn't happen necessarily without any gear. You do need some tools, especially if you're trying to find a sound that is like an effect sound. You need to find some things. Now, that said, I think I could get something similar with a Fractal product, with a Boss product, with MXR products, right? The Line 6 is not the thing here. It's the concept. The concept is the thing. But first, with effects, it is all about discovering your inspiration, asking where you're from, what do you love, or even, it doesn't have to be about your past. It can be about what you love right now. If you're listening to music and you hear something, you're like, God, I love the way that sounds. What is it? Find it. Maybe you need to buy the certain thing, but what if it's just a concept that you can apply to the gear that you already have, right? Gear is about inspiration. To me, the reason for having a piece of gear is, will it inspire me? Will it give me goosebumps? Will it make me play something that I haven't played before? Will it feel like home? Will it make me feel good? Will it make me feel happy? And sometimes I think, if we're honest, we hope that gear is going to do that, and then it doesn't. And then it's the search. Ooh, we get kind of addicted to the search. But I want to implore you, just as I'm imploring myself today, that the gear is not going to make you better, but the search for your sound, the search for inspiration is not fruitless. That is a worthwhile endeavor. And sometimes that does come down to finding the right bass, the right amp, the right pedal for the thing that you're trying to do. But it should start with intent. I want it to start with intent for me. I want it to start here first. And I'm pointing to my head. I want it to start with intent. I want it to start with a reference versus just like, well, what gear purchase could I make that would be a 3% increase? What cables should I buy for a more clear tone? That, I think, is fruitless. I think it's more about, what thing should I buy that is going to bring new music out of me? I really want to slap the bass, for instance. Well, I wonder if I should get some light gauge strings so that's a worthwhile endeavor, because you have a goal, right? Set an intention, set a goal, and work backwards. Don't let the gear lead the charge. I hope this has been helpful for you. I think it's actually been sort of helpful for me. So thank you so much. I love doing this podcast. We will be back next week, Scott and Ian together again, unless Scott's out of town again, in which case it'll just be me again. It'll be your boy again. But I appreciate you so much. I love doing this podcast, and I will catch you later. Take care, everybody.